What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. One of the dynamics that I'm starting to pick up on is whenever very powerful points packages that were propping up mid-range decks get nerfed, one of the immediate reactions is for the metagame to devolve into incredibly combo-centric styles of play. And I think this is how we end up with the first deck on the tier list being a Hela deck, because what happens when we nerf things like Fenris Wolf and Juggernaut is not necessarily that these decks get worse at beating Hela, although the Fenris Wolf stuff does matter. It's that it becomes harder to fit tech cards that are relevant against these decks into those packages. Cards like Mobius and Stardust are largely propped up by the ability of decks to fit them in without sacrificing their general points game plan. Because they're not relevant in every matchup, they have to be worth the slot. And when your general slot is worth a lot more because you need it in order to enact your points-based game plan, it can be harder to get a Mobius into your deck. It can be harder to get a Stardust into your deck. And I think the nerfs to decks like Invisible Woman First Steps, which were very ready homes for cards like Stardust, did really impact the fact that Hela is very good now. This was not a deck that could really get off the ground against Stardust as long as the Invisible Woman First Steps decks were playing it, but those got nerfed again with the nerf to Fantasticar, and now suddenly there's just not really a lot of the counter in the meta right now. So what's happening is Hela is stomping all over everything that isn't playing Stardust, and that pushes people to play more combo decks so they can go over the top of Hela, which is okay, I suppose, as long as we eventually rein it in. I personally do believe that there are probably good Stardust shells out there to be found, and Stardust is a really relevant counter against a deck like this. But I do think that this is the direction the metagame is headed in right now. Once you lose out on all of these very reasonable, powerful, mid-rangey decks that are easily able to change their tech against whatever the dominant combo deck of the moment is, you end up with some pretty dominant combo decks that start pushing the metagame in weird ways. Like, WolfHand is a really good deck at beating up on anything that is trying to play a remotely fair game plan, but it doesn't necessarily have a lot of inbuilt answers for things like this. And I think this is the kind of metagame that can start to punish decks like this if it gets a little bit too out of hand. I don't think we're out of hand yet, but I think it is the direction that we're heading that is worrying, if anything. As is, I think WolfHand is still a very solid deck, but once it starts having to take slots away from getting its own power on the board in order to preemptively run these tech cards and giving up the power that comes with it, like, for example, taking Juggernaut out to put Stardust in so you don't get instantly obliterated by anyone who plays a Corvus Glaive on turn 3. That kind of stuff is what you really have to keep your eye on in decks like this, and decks like this are sort of the last vestige of the, like, good stuff mid-range deck, the sort of triumvirate that we had of, like, various Fenris Wolf Cannonball Mercury decks, which got nerfed last patch, Invisible Woman decks, which got nerfed both the patch before last and last patch. Victoria Hand's really the only one standing, so this is where I would look for innovation to come in, someone to figure out what the minimum Victoria Hand package is, and eventually figure out, like, okay, here's what the Victoria Hand plus tech deck looks like, so we are able to sort of rein in these various combo decks that are running around, because it's not just Hela. There are a bunch of Pixie decks running around, there are Mr. Negative decks running around, decks that are generally checked by mostly one card's existence, Stardust and Mobius. We're gonna have to start seeing a lot more of those cards if those decks are to be hated out of the metagame. So you end up with something that looks a little bit more like this, which is appealing to me, but there's sort of inherent anti-synergy between the Fenris Wolf stuff going on here and Stardust, or I guess positive synergy if you really don't want to pull anything off of a Gladiator. But there is something to be said for just figuring out what it is that we want to be investing in a shell like this, the things that are locked in, right? Like we have the V-Hand stuff, but then we go to like all of this other tech stuff, and it starts to make me wonder if the V-Hand is even going to be worth running in this context. Because what this really is a Misery Hood deck that is playing a bunch of tech to try to beat up on the things that are vulnerable to tech. Or we could just go back to Wiccan, playing the one relevant tech card to Hela and just be an okay thing to do as well. This list comes from KM Worst. I think it's probably the best Wiccan deck that I've seen in a very long time, and I do think that it's probably a very safe place to start right now. If I were picking a deck that I feel like is a safe choice just to climb a little bit, this has baseline good stuff built into it. It has a very relevant tech card, and as a Wiccan deck, it is very able to actually play that tech card when it is relevant and not feel too bad about it when it is not. A 4/7 can be a little bit awkward. Oh, I don't want to play that. I want to play my Wiccan instead. In any matchup where this card is relevant, it is 50 times better than playing a Wiccan. Just full stop. It is way, 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 way better because it basically instantly wins the game if you play it with priority. Being a Wiccan deck, you are very likely to have priority, which makes this a very good shell for what this deck is trying to do. There are too many specific Pixie decks for me to talk about any individual one. I like this one a lot. It comes from Pixie Chef, but there are plenty of others. There's the Ultron version of the Patriot one. There's the Gore Mystique version. And the long story short of it is all of these decks are doing basically the same thing, which is trying to scam you, play a pseudo Mr. Negative game plan, but in doing so, also play some other powerful stuff. There are generally some upsides and downsides to like how invested in Pixie you actually get. Being super invested in Pixie means that you're not as functional when you don't have Pixie. What I like about this deck is it's functional both with and without Pixie. I think that's a very solid place to be. I like the Black Swan thing as a way of mitigating the downside of one costs with Pixie. For those who are unaware, this will affect all of your one cost cards no matter what they actually cost. So anything that you Pixied from a one cost to something else, i.e. a Nico Minoru, will go to 0 if you activate that Black Swan. It's a really cool point allocation strategy that this deck has access to, and I think the fact that it's a balanced with and without Pixie deck is really, really relevant. I've seen a lot of hype for the Ultron version of the Pixie deck that basically, in my opinion, does not hold up. A lot of that hype is based on stats from pre-Infinite. When I checked the stats on the Ultron version of the list at Infinite, at top 10% Infinite, it was 46% win rate and negative cube rate. I do not think that is the direction that I would go if I were trying to climb, largely because when a deck has a good pre-infinite stats but bad post-infinite stats, typically what that means is it's beating up on bots, which is definitely an advantage that Pixie decks have. They are quite good into those robot friends of ours that exist at the lower ranks. I think Cerebro 3 is actually quite good still. Like, yes, the loss of Juggernaut was very meaningful to this deck, but the move package does give it some real oomph in a way that I don't necessarily think has been accounted for by people playing against it. Cerebro 3 is another one of those decks, though, that is looking to play a game of Marvel Snap that is not really a game of Marvel Snap, because it's very unlikely that you, if you are playing a normal Marvel Snap deck, are going to be able to beat them. And largely that metagame trend is the thing that I have noticed the very most. There is a lot of I don't really want to care about any of the turns that aren't turn 6 happening right now, whether that be because your turn 6 is a Cerebro Mystique, because your turn 6 is a Hela, because your turn 6 is a combination of cards that shouldn't be what they cost because of Pixie or Mr. Negative. There is a lot of the board state doesn't really meaningfully matter to me happening in Marvel Snap right now. I gotta tell you, not my favorite kind of metagame, and I've been hearing similar stuff from other people. The combo-centric, all that matters is the final turn of the game state of this current metagame has been typically, I think, honestly, I think that a lot of good players don't like playing like that because it doesn't really feel like anything other than gambling. I can't really speak to anything beyond that, just that I've had a couple of good players come to me and say they really haven't enjoyed the post-OTA meta because of the combo-centric nature of the gameplay and because that it doesn't actually seem to reward anything other than I built my deck to do the biggest possible thing on the final turn of the game, and Cerebro is definitely one of the culprits here. Another major culprit is Mr. Negative. In my view, if you are generally messing around with Pixie, the more aggressive you get with your Pixie hits, i.e. the more 1s and 6s you run, the more you might as well just be playing Mr. Negative, and you should probably just go queue that up instead. The other possible use case for Pixie in that context is Pixie gets to play a game plan that is similar to Mr. Negative, but also has Mobius. I buy that as a positive use case of Pixie right now. For what it's worth, I am very in on Pixie decks that have Mobius right now, just because you want to play Mobius against a variety of things. As I discussed, there are a lot of combo decks running around right now, so you can end up in a very awkward situation if you're not playing the counters to those combo decks, or something that can high roll to that same degree. Mr. Negative is one of the best high roll decks in the game. It will be able to outpoint a large variety of things, although there is one notable thing that I don't like about this deck specifically moving forward. I don't know if you're aware of this. I'm sure you are. It turns out Arnim Zola gets hard shut off by Stardust, and if more people start playing Stardust, you're going to want to move away from the Zola null part of this deck. It is such a weird experience to play Silver Surfer, because in the abstract, the deck is quite strong, but in the specific, you'll run into these matchups against decks like Hela, against decks like various Pixie Gore things, and you'll just sort of look at them, and they'll look at you, and then they'll play 80 points, and you won't have anything you can do about it. Surfer's weird. Like, this is a deck that I think is actually objectively fairly strong, but it just doesn't have any meaningful way of interacting. This deck is secretly a combo deck. This deck does points, and it combos its cards in almost the same way as a Cerebro deck would. But it doesn't necessarily do so to the degree of the other combo decks in this metagame, which makes me feel weird about it, because I feel like this is actually a deck that has pretty good matchups against a lot of the good stuff decks. If people are going to be out here playing Mobius, then you're going to be in a good spot, because that doesn't really do a ton against you. You can get owned by a Stardust on your Brood, but mostly that doesn't do a ton against you either. And you have these massive upside plays. Like, for example, did you know that if you play a Captain Carter and it passes its buff onto a Fallen One, you get the Fallen One points that way? Like, there's just a lot of easy ways to get energy and use it powerfully in this deck, but there's basically no ways to interact. And this is sort of what I'm talking about when I discuss how it is that these decks are building for points at the expense of interaction, because there's not really a good place to fit the interaction in. If you take any part of this machine out to put an interactive piece in, well, then the machine starts working at a less high capacity. I can't take out one of these 4s to fit a Stardust in. That's ridiculous. I just can't do it. They feed the rest of the cards, and so you don't end up with a deck that can play meaningful interaction against the things your opponents are doing. You end up going power to power with them, and a lot of combo decks end up going over the top, which is not to say this deck is bad. Again, I think it's good. It's just poorly positioned right now. Splat has farmed all the way into the top 50 with a deck that is literally just points. This might as well be a high voltage deck. Like, I looked the older version of this deck up on Untapped, and they had it tagged as the archetype being high voltage. Again, ridiculous, but it goes to show you where this metagame is at. It's literally just numbers. There's nothing special about this deck. It's just numbers. That is all that is happening in Marvel Snap right now. The first 5 turns of the game do not matter. The numbers on the final turn of the game, that's what matter. What cards can you put together to make the biggest numbers? Because right now, things are attacking from too diverse a direction for people to meaningfully run tech against them. And I don't know how long that's going to remain true, but the current state of the metagame is such that there are too many different ways for people to attack a bunch of numbers on the final turn of the game, and no one deck can run all of the cards that meaningfully deal with all of those threats right now. I've tried to find it. I got kind of close, but I am not overly confident that I have a deck like that. And a lot of that is because they have been repeatedly hitting these tech cards. And what happens when you eventually start weakening these floodgates? Well, I mean, the flood gets in. One, I think, possibly productive way you can attack these decks that are just looking to do final turn stuff is just put a bunch of rocks in their deck. I'm not confident it's good enough, but it is at least a plan in a world where a lot of these mid-range decks have no plan whatsoever. Like, a lot of what I've experienced has been mid-range decks being wholly unprepared for anything that is going to actually just dominate them on turn 6. Whether that be Cerebro, whether that be the decks that would die to Enchantress but nobody's playing Enchantress, the decks that would die to Stardust but nobody's playing Stardust, the decks that would die to Mobius but nobody's playing Mobius. Whatever it is, people are not prepared for it, just fundamentally. And those decks are strong enough now that there's no, invisible woman deck that's able to match them on points or whatever. you're just kind of getting run over a lot. And so you have a deck like this that at least has a thought process behind it, which is like, okay, they're going to do their dummy turn 6 less of the time. And I think that's solid, but it's very hard to snap into, because by the time turn 3 comes around and you're playing that Terrax, I mean, first of all, if they're against a Hela deck, they've already seen 7 cards, one of which is Agatha, right? So they're about 50% to have the Hela. Not even talking about various ways in which they could blink into the Hela later or things of that nature. It feels like I would want to be able to snap Terrax and say, you're not getting your stuff, but they're actually just 50% to already have it at that point. And so you're sitting there looking at them like, aha, I've disrupted you. You have been disrupted. But you don't know if they actually have. And if they haven't, you instantly lose the game. Very weird spot. Here we see yet another deck that is fine, but also if you run into one of those combo decks, you have absolutely no gas. This is basically exactly the same position that Surfer finds itself in, where in a normal meta game, I think these decks would be regarded as like pretty good staples of the meta. But in the one that we're in right now, if you queue into a Hela, you just lose. Like you just don't actually beat them outside of a scam. If they do their thing, you just do not win. And the same is true for a lot of these decks. And what has happened, and I think this is a really important point to drive home, is that as decks have gotten more synergistic, typically that has allowed them to have a higher point output. But that higher point output is still not reaching what a combo deck can reach. And because these decks are so synergistic, because if you remove one piece, the whole thing starts to fall apart in a greater degree than would otherwise happen, you can't really meaningfully tech them. That's what's really difficult. There's not a small package of cards that you can run and feel good into these decks while also running tech. And until that is happening, I sort of think that we're going to be in a situation where combo decks are running a little bit wild. In terms of trying to deal with this kind of stuff, this is as far as I got. It was pretty damn good for me, but it's still so finicky. When you do the points, it's very good, but there have been enough points stripped out of this deck that I'm not necessarily confident that I can go power to power with a Surfer deck, or I can go power to power with a Scream deck, because I have put these tech cards in here so I'm not dead to the combo decks, but in so doing, I might have given up the mid-range deck matchup. And the idea is, in a real world, we would be able to find a deck that can do something like play Stardust and Mobius, but also not be dead to the various powerful Surfer, Scream type stuff that does exist in the metagame, Victoria Hand, things like that. And I think that previously those decks have existed in a very, very meaningful part of this metagame. But right now, this is as good as I can get. It feels a little bit lackluster compared to what we used to have, and I'm not sure it's enough to hold back the tide. I do like being a Mobius Stardust deck, and I do think that's probably where you need to be right now, but you need to have a deck that supports them, and you need to have an infrastructure that supports them. And what that means is you need to have a deck that can win games in the games those cards don't matter. And I'm not sure I've found it yet. Glenn Jones tweeted out Jets list. I hope this will serve for a destroy deck at the end of the tier list. But this is just the same thing, right? It's just another deck where you're like, look at my dumb turn 6. Haha, I'm doing something stupid on turn 6. Haha. Yeah, I mean, that's what's going on here, right? Like that's the thing that's happening. We're trying to do something really stupid on turn 6, and hopefully our opponents will not have anything that is good into this is the fifth deck that we've talked about today that is a turn 6 deck meant to beat up on mid-range decks. Eventually those turn 6 decks are going to realize they need to beat up on each other, and that will start a sort of race to the top where whoever just does the most points ends up being the turn 6 deck of the week. Right now it's Hela, which I don't think is a long-term state of affairs. I'm not sure how many people have sort of grasped that this is what is happening in the metagame outside of Top Infinite right now, but I am interested to see what happens going into the next month, because there's a lot of just really scary end of game kind of stuff happening right now. And as much as I think it's reasonable to complain about, oh man, I hate losing all these tech cards, I gotta tell you, not having a good shell to put my tech cards in, that also doesn't feel great. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. Before I dip out here, though, I do want to say one thing, which is I really would like people to have a little bit more sympathy for how hard it is to balance a game. I don't want to just go from complaining about tech cards to complaining about what happens when tech cards aren't there, without acknowledging that it's just hard to make things actually feel good for everyone in this kind of context. And I just want to fully put that out there that, like, I don't blame, you know, the developers for this or whatever. I don't want this to be like a thing where it's like, oh, it's time to flame. I just think maybe they went just a half step too far in this direction, maybe a little bit. We'll see how things shake out. Obviously, this is still a pretty early metagame, but I do fear that the more the game becomes about my turn 6 invalidates the prior 5 turns, the less fun things actually are going to be. That is largely the dynamic that I don't like about decks like this. And just because I haven't found a good deck that can run both Hela and Mobius to deal with the decks that are mostly doing that, I do think that it's not it's entirely possible that that deck still does exist and we'll just have to figure it out and whatever. But largely, I think people misunderstand where my dislike for Hela comes from. I think people think that it's about like RNG or whatever. It's not about that. It's about that nothing matters about how the game actually played out. None of the cards in my deck playing against you matter unless I Stardust you. We're just not actually playing a game unless that happens. And I think that dynamic is the thing that I'd be worried about. Right now, I'm not overly worried about it, but I will name a couple of names. Like 2 top 10 players have come to me and they've said, I really don't like this metagame being so combo focused. And so it is something that is like on the back of my mind in terms of someone who focuses a lot on like the high end of ladder. I'm actually relatively on the lower end here. I think I have more tolerance for this than I think most people do. Like normally I'd be the one screaming about Hela, but really for me, it's just, can we find a good Stardust deck? And if we can't, I think that's a problem of the context around Stardust, not necessarily a problem of Hela even. Like, I think we have the tools. We just got to figure them out and like put them to work. And I think we can do it. And I think, I guess what that means is like Stardust might be my favorite card ever, because normally I'd be losing my mind right now. Anyway, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.